Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 22nd of March 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson, and joining me on Skype today is Brian Gerrish and also Alex Thompson. Welcome to the programme, both. Alex, we're going to start off straight away with what we might call the terror threat, which is being built up in Europe at the moment. And you wanted to start with the bomb threat in Paris. Financial district evacuated?
Yes, just to say that the kinds of terror actions that Paris is seeing are increasing. So we've now got the Rue des Italiens, one of the major thoroughfares in Paris, completely evacuated, the equivalent perhaps of clearing out Oxford Street or something of that nature, because of some so-called credible threat which has been issued. And we don't know who's behind the threat, but it shows that, as well as these bloodbaths or apparent bloodbaths, which may have been real, staged, faked, attributed to the wrong people, we also have very real bomb threats of the 1970s type that we saw in London. And it seems to be on the rise with the French elections 33 days away now, so just over a month. We can expect more and more of this, I fear.
But although we're not getting actual events like this, we are seeming to see lots of simulated terror attacks going on in the UK at the moment.
Yes, here's one in Meadowhall in South Yorkshire, and this happened on the Monday. But then at the weekend, we also had one in the City of London, and here it is in The Guardian. Hundreds of armed police, read that again, hundreds of armed police stage terror drill on Thames tourist ship. And when did they do this? At 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. That used to be the time when the nation was at church, of course. And it seems to be the hour of choice now for population frightening measures. It wasn't so long ago my father told me about being pulled over for what seemed to be, we used to call them an MOT, but a Department of Transport inspections now with a policeman standing by. And he was asked, "What is the purpose of your journey this morning, sir?" in this very Nazi way. And he said, "Well, I was going to go to church, but by the time you finish checking my car over, it'll be time to go home. So I'm just going to turn around and go straight home." And they just glowered at him. They didn't see the humour of the situation. So Sunday mornings is the time of preference, it seems, for this now. And this particular drill in the city on Sunday at 11 o'clock ended up with at least one of these actors being thrown overboard in a kind of replica of what we would expect to see in a real fake terrorist situation.
Well, before I ask Brian for some thoughts on this, let's just mention this. Of course, the laptop ban, which was brought in yesterday. Large phones, laptops and tablets not allowed to be in cabins on flights to the UK from Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan and Tunisia. And I've captioned this because a bomb in a hold will not bring down the plane. I mean, this is clearly simply a PR exercise. It can have no other purpose, because if you bring a bomb on a plane, it doesn't matter whether it's in the cabin or it's in the hold. It's going to destroy that aircraft. So this is an additional security measure, they say, which is going to cause some disruption for passengers and flights. The government understands the frustration that it will cause, but the government's top priority, they say, will always be to maintain the safety of British nationalists. Direct flights to the UK from those destinations can continue to operate to the UK subject to the new measures being in place. So the implication here is that any airline not willing to impose these measures would not be allowed to fly to the UK, and travellers are advised to keep up to date with the latest travel advice from the government. Brian, this is just a PR exercise, is it not?
We could call it a PR exercise, Michael. We could call it a nationwide psychological operation, and I prefer to call it the latter, because I think this is calculated. We've got the government using its agencies, which could be just the police. It certainly involves special departments within the police force, and the defence agencies. What is the game? It is to ram terror into the minds of people, to get them frightened. And once they're sufficiently frightened, of course, the hope is that whatever the government says is needed to protect them, people will accept. I'll just add to that I remember my conversation with a Metropolitan Police person. I won't say whether it was a man or a woman, but basically they were talking about the prevent strategy and how in their opinion, the PREVENT strategy as pushed out by the Metropolitan Police was being used to create fear, and it was also being used to groom youngsters, particularly Asian youngsters, into some form of alignment with terrorism. The other thing that person said to me is that vast amounts of money, they said billions of pounds worth of money, were being used to push that agenda, but there was no proper paperwork or document trail to explain how the money was being spent. So I think we're starting to see some very, very dangerous psychological operations carried out by the British government in UK.
Okay, thanks for that, Brian. Now, let's move on to Russia. And Alex, this report from the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, the United Kingdom's relations with Russia, 7th report of session 2016-2017. What stuck out for you on this?
What really I saw was that this was a hopeful sign that the Foreign Affairs Select Committee is beginning to ask the last few Russia specialists in our academic setup the reasons why we cannot engage with Russia just at a culture to culture or a population to population level. And there's a paragraph which I found was particularly interesting. And that is paragraph 170 here. Thank you for putting that up on screen. And this is when the FASC was taking witness statements from a particularly good academic, Dr. Aver at Birmingham, who is one of the greatest Slavicists in the country. And he commented to the FCO about the reason why the Foreign and Commonwealth Office itself doesn't seem to know enough about Russia. And he says the Eastern Research Group is staffed by excellent people who stay in the group for many years. They have a tremendous amount of knowledge about Russia, I would say on an academic level, but there is something like 5 or 6 of them dealing with the entire post-Soviet space, less the Baltic states. That's Russia plus 11 countries. They are looking at politics, political economy, security, and so on. That seems to me to be pretty woeful. They engage with academia and the expert community. They try their best, but that is laughable, really. And this is 2017, so this is a good 15 years since I shadowed one of these experts at the Eastern Research Group for a full week in the FCO, and it was 5 or 6 people even then, with them threatening always to leave. There was no continuity anymore, because these Eastern Research Group analysts, who were the only people who spoke Russian fluently in the FCO and whatnot, apart from a few people out in the field, were simply being put upon from 8 a.m. till 10 p.m. To being wrung like a sponge by all these hangers-on and ministerial apparatchiks, saying, what about this aspect of Russia? What about that aspect of the Caucasus? People who couldn't be bothered to do basic research for themselves. So and in the evenings, they always had to go out to soirees and Chatham House type think tank events, which they hated. Not that they said it so openly, but I could see it. So that's the problem, basically. We have something like a tiny fraction, perhaps 1/5 of the Russia experts working in our apparatus that Germany or France have, for example.
Yes, and you wanted to also mention this tweet, NATO logic, Russia's reinforcements inside its own borders can't be seen as defence, but British troops massing in Estonia is defensive. Well, we could have a discussion about whether British troops are massing, because of course 800 in total isn't really a mass, but nonetheless, the point is well made. Why there is a double standard here?
Yes, and of course Brian McDonald is, I think, an Irish journalist in Moscow, and he's making the point pretty obviously. And here's his evidence. That on the left we've got Der Spiegel there saying German intelligence tells Der Spiegel that the Russian military build-up, as they call it, on the Estonian border cannot be seen as defensive. And a couple of 100 yards the other side of the border, in the town of Narva, with an ethnic Russian population, we've got Britain as the framework nation leading the Estonians in aggressive military displays, and that is defensive apparently. So this is the sheerest hypocrisy.
I mean, what's your understanding of the feeling of people within the Baltic states to the movement of NATO into their country? Are people on the street saying this is an invasion, perhaps, or are they actually welcoming this?
The problem is, and I'll confine it to Estonia because that's the Baltics at their most extreme, shall we say? And of course, I've mentioned before, but that's a map of Estonia behind me. You can see how small the country is, with the Russian border out on the just by where my head is, basically. The problem is that Estonians had such a painful past with, as did Latvia, by the way, with a large fraction of the population being deported by Stalin and murdered in horrendous ways. They have had a decades-long policy of associating Russian with Soviet. The more intelligent half of the nation is now starting to think, well, actually, you can be a patriotic Estonian and appreciate that the Russians had a rum deal and they were the victims of socialism too. So those kinds of people are beginning to say, have we spent the 20th century thinking in vain that the Allies are going to come to our rescue? I mean, there was a time in Estonia and Latvia when these post-World War II resistance movements, the Forest Brethren, actually spoke openly of their hope that the Brits and Americans would arrive on a fabled white ship and save them all. That's the kind of thinking that, because they were in a totally totally impossible situation. And so that's why they have welcomed the Brits and Americans with open arms. To some extent, the Germans, so that's a bit more sensitive. And now they are starting to get cold feet, I think it's fair to say. And there's some hopeful signs, I would call them hopeful, that you could say Estonian nationalists and Russian nationalists within Estonia are starting to think, well, let's stop beating each other up and fighting meme wars and flame wars against each other on internet. And let's actually ask ourselves whether we can't live in peace without any foreign intervention.
Yeah, okay. Well, sticking with NATO then, yesterday, today and tomorrow is the NATO Transformation Seminar 2017. This apparently is improving today, shaping tomorrow, and keeping the edge by bridging the two. It's being held in Budapest partnered with the International Institute for Strategic Studies. It's being held in the Budapest Marriott Hotel. Hungary serves as a venue for most of the events of this particular organization, the NATO Transformation Group. It's chaired by the NATO Military Committee. Military representatives and strategic commanders are going to be there as well to discuss the strategic challenges to NATO, the challenges they're going to face and how they're going to transform to meet those. That's going to facilitate robust discussion, apparently. Well, the focus today was on this document from the International Institute of Strategic Studies, a federated way ahead for NATO in an age of complexity. Alex, you've had a look at this. What, in your opinion, is the definition of federated? What are they talking about? How are they transforming NATO into a federated organization?
10 years ago, there was a flurry of academic articles, not so much from within NATO, but from the experts who feed off the fringes of groups like NATO, which was saying NATO needs to transform into something that encompasses the entire Northern Hemisphere, minus a couple of pariah states. Let's call it global NATO. It will subsume the Middle East and there'll be no more wars in the Muslim world. That was the naive thinking of 2006-ish. And this is the next stage. This is a group of generals posing as academics, really, within NATO, saying, wouldn't it be great if, they don't mention Germany or Russia by name, but wouldn't it be great if Germany and a club of European countries could pool their resources and, on the spur of the moment, attack Russia, which they don't name either as a country, without having to go through these boring political channels and parliaments approving NATO member states' contingents. And they maunder on about how ISAF and other forms of intervention in Afghanistan, especially the AMN, the Afghanistan Mission Network here, took years for democratic governments and sovereign peoples to ratify. Yawnsome, let's not have that again, they say. Let's have a federated approach. There's shocking stuff in here. It's about, let's be like IBM, a very dodgy globalist business in its past. Let's turn our fortunes around like IBM did. And then completely inappropriate things. Let's use the business model of Uber and Airbnb. I mean, here on the continent, these are buzzwords out of the English-speaking world that they use all the time now. Let's be a shared economy and a sharing economy. And that stuff is in here. Potential crises on the territory of NATO will, in all likelihood, involve others, they say, whether it is near neighbours like Finland or Sweden, or other regional powers. Now, we've already seen Finland and Sweden, against the will of their own peoples and their own constitutions, joining in NATO joint exercises against Russia. And towards the end, we have this very interesting header, a mindset to bridge the gap. NATO needs a mindset to bridge the gap. And then towards the end, they say what this will mean in practice. And they say basically that the Russians have got wise to what NATO is up to, and they're trying to copy that business model. And they're trying to seek to leverage the expertise of member nations in the framework nation concept, which is the means by which Britain takes Estonia, the Canadians take Latvia, the Germans take Lithuania, and the Americans take Poland, and harden them all up. So in the end, we will apparently hand all those hardened border nations over to Germany. And in this new federated concept, Germany plus the, Middle Europa world will be able to hurl itself at Russia without the niceties of having to seek approval in the French and British parliaments.
Well, there was one other dimension to this, which was while they were taking questions following their sort of plenary session, Rose Guttemüller, who's the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, was saying, this is kind of paraphrasing her, but this is what she was saying: we need to break down the silos between military and civilian institutions. And of course, this is reflecting, we've been talking about this for a couple of years now, because this is reflecting and echoing the policy expressed by Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, and Federica Mogherini, basically the European Union's foreign minister, at the European Defence Agency conference in November 2015. And the main focus of that conference was exactly this: blurring the lines between military and civilian agencies. So, I mean, that adds a whole dimension to what you've just said, Alex.
Oh, definitely, Mike. And this is common purpose language coming full circle, because any old armchair general in business likes to use and misappropriate military technology they don't understand, military terminology that they don't understand. And one of those terms that was borrowed by the precursors of common purpose about 1980 odd was this idea of a silo. In American English, you talk about a grain silo, basically a shaft where you store grain. But the main meaning of a silo, of course, something that's narrow and deep like that, is something to store a missile in. And it became a buzzword for people are thinking and acting in silos. It was a way of saying people are basically sticking to their own remit and not acting ultra vires beyond authority. And we need to put a stop to that. Our people must act beyond authority and outside silos. And after a generation of being in public service in that mold, even the civilianized thinkers at the top of NATO, who should be military men, are starting to say the same thing when they know jolly well what a silo is. So they're basically saying, ignore your remit, act beyond your rank, and basically start to take command of civilian policing and civilian command of defence authorities. So treason, subversion, all the words we usually use, which are highly applicable here.
Brian, any thoughts on this? Because this is a massive breakdown of any kind of separation of powers.
It certainly is, Mike, and I'm thinking we could probably have an hour's discussion just on this topic. But one of the things I'll pick up on is that Alex has just mentioned generals acting as academics, and then later on he's pointing out that we've got generals starting to use corporatist speak, if I've got this right. So initially, people in the private sector delight in being able to use quasi military terms. Now we've got it spinning back the other way, that we've got people in the military using business terms. And in fact, I think we had a slide for one of the senior British generals a few months ago where he was describing the army as a business. So there's clearly an agenda in the way that these people talk, and that leads us to who is training the military in particular. And I think we should be starting to show great interest in the fact that we had, I think it was the Daily Mail reporting that Barclays Bank was going to be running military training courses within its own headquarter facilities. That is a very interesting point. But we also know that we've got Barclays Bank and Goldman Sachs Bank intimately involved in training within Sandhurst in UK. So at the moment, we are seeing that operating out of silos is meaning that instead of having defence matters ring-fenced with some sort of control, they are defence matters. We've got any old person coming in and sharing the pot. And of course, the door was opened. The Trojan horse was common purpose, which worked extremely hard to get in amongst military people some 10 years ago. Now we're seeing these big corporations like banks working directly with the military. And I better just end by saying, and of course, we've had David Ellis pointing out that Britain's nuclear deterrent going to France and then Germany, what that really is ultimately is the deterrent controlled by the European Central Bank and its masters.
Alex.
Yes, just to say that one of our best chat room people has put his finger on it. There was a paper on this in 2004 called the Venusberg. So you spell that as Venusberg, B-E-R-G at the end, all one word. The Venusberg paper of 2004 was written by the Bertelsmann Media Group, which is basically the CIA posing as an independent German media. And the CIA directed Bertelsmann to write in this 2004 paper that the military and the German conglomerate will get its way through what they called civilian instruments, or sometimes civil instruments. Zivilinstrumente, I think, in German. What they mean by that is assets who pose as independent military men or who pose as academics who are in fact in hoc to the military-industrial complex. So that American-German axis over the heads of the American and German people has been going on since the Clinton era, when Clinton landed in Berlin and hailed Germany as Europe's natural leader, much to John Major's shock. So it's a long-term thing, and Britain is not central to this policy at all. We're just being tugged along and being strung along that we're still important, but we will have to double down and do as we're told in this thinking as well. It's just that we have too many democratic safeguards to allow us to ratify such NATO adventurism. So that's why this federated structure is being put in place, so that we're irrelevant to that decision-making process.
Okay, well, I think we'll be mentioning Bertelsmann a bit later on, but in the meantime, let's move on to Parliament, Brian, and apparently we're going to get an explanation as to what Parliament is.
Well, this is astonishing, Mike, and first of all, I'm going to thank the lady who pointed this out to me this morning. But we've got Parliament launching Parliament Explained, and if you just progress that slide, here we get some of the things that it's talking about. So we've got a number of parts of Parliament that are going to be explained. The public apparently needs to understand this. But if we go on to the next slide, who is actually going to be running this programme? Well, it's going to be presented by a comedian. I am not making this up. This is go to the www.parliament.uk website. So we're going to have a special initiative to explain Parliament to all of us ignorant of the public, and that is going to be presented by a comedian. Now, I don't regard this as humorous at all. I actually think that what we're seeing here is the establishment beginning to panic that all the wider public are waking up to what our constitution is really about, how our system of law should work, with juries making the decisions, not the judges. And I think this is a crude attempt of Parliament to try and claw back the initiative and say, oh, well, you don't really understand how Parliament works. We, Parliament, need to tell you how it's done. And because you're only children, we're going to use a lady comedian to explain it to you. I think this is another sign of absolute panic by Westminster that people are waking up.
Yes. Okay. Well, Ministry of Justice then has now announced that they are requiring to provide 5,000 new prison places, modern prison places. This is following on from the Prisons and Courts Bill, which we mentioned yesterday. It's going through Parliament, or at least being debated in Parliament this week. So Liz Truss has announced plans to create 5,000 modern prison places. She talks about it as if it's jobs, and it is related to jobs in some respect, because these new bills are going to create up to 2,000 construction jobs, generate millions of pounds for the British economy, apparently, perhaps millions of pounds of profits ultimately for G4S and the like, or Sodexo, or companies like this. I don't know how much it's going to do for the local community on a long-term basis. They say it's going to build on the government's commitment to create up to 10,000 modern prison places aimed at reducing overcrowding and creating the right conditions for reform. But here's the but, because the final decisions on the new prisons are subject to planning approvals and as well as value for money and affordability. So actually, it's not a done deal yet. It's just an announcement, which doesn't mean very much. Liz Truss says that this significant building programme will not only help create a modern prison estate where wholesale reform can truly take root, but will also provide thriving economic lifeline for the local community. Is that what prisons are about, Brian?
Well, I'm smiling as you're taking us through that, Mike, because this to me is just astonishing. This is in our faces. We have a dictatorship being installed in this country. The Tories are bringing it in. It's becoming ever more obvious. And what are we supposed to believe here? That building more prisons is good for the economy, it's good for society. No, no, no. We're building more prisons because we're building a police state. And obviously anybody that challenges the government in particular is going to end up in prison. And we've already seen the effect of commercialisation of the prison service. We've got falling standards compared to the often career for life warders of the past, many of whom believed that they were actually doing a good job and tried to do a good job. Now we've got the cheapest people being recruited. And as we've seen with Melanie Shaw, absolutely horrific treatment of people inside prisons, including the denial of medication and keeping them in long-term solitary. So I think this is a soft sell of another key part of the British dictatorship.
But Alex, it's not just Britain going this way. What's going on in Ireland that we're asking, is Ireland becoming a police state?
Well, we had better let the campaigners of Integrity Ireland say that for themselves. So I will read out what they say in their newsletter. It's just the paragraph that's on the first page there. I think it's worth reading out in full to people. They explain the situation as follows. The plain fact of the matter is that we do not have a properly functioning justice system in Ireland. What we have is a network of state agencies overseen by far too many unscrupulous, politically connected individuals whose first and only priority is to protect the status quo and their own cosy place on the gravy train. As we have seen recently with the McCabe, that was a whistleblower policeman, the McCabe sex smear scandals, the horror of the Tuam babies, the babies' bodies thrown into septic tanks in County Galway by nuns, and with the appalling criminal neglect and abuse of vulnerable children in state care, the one unifying response by all Irish state agencies involved in this is to try to deny the facts, suppress the evidence and protect the wrongdoers. Senior politicians casually lie through their teeth with gall and impunity, while the Minister for Justice directs the machinery of the so-called justice system to intimidate, oppress and tyrannise anyone who speaks up for real justice. And as we have seen repeatedly, neither police management, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, nor the courts have any scruples whatsoever when it comes to dealing with dissenting voices. If crimes have to be committed and laws have to be broken in order to protect an utterly rotten establishment, then so be it. Nothing is off limits anymore. Intimidation and false arrests by Gardaí, Irish police, perjury, fraud and forgery by lawyers, judges in blatant contempt of their own courts and in violation of the law, and an army of often uncooperative and obstructive courts service personnel, some of whom seem to gain a perverse satisfaction from the frustration and misery that they cause to so many struggling lay litigants. With all due and sincere respect to those in agencies of the Irish state who do try their best in these compromised surroundings, the plain fact of the matter is that we do not have a functioning justice system at all. What we have is a publicly funded network of connected individuals who have basically hijacked the instruments and agencies of the state in order to feather their own nests and suppress any public dissent or disapproval. Unfortunately, Ireland is just small enough and just big enough to be almost perfectly corrupted. We are big enough to be thought of, they mean in Europe, as a modern democracy, but small enough to be able to hide most of our dirty secrets. Entirely true of Scotland and Wales, by the way. Our mainstream media, controlled by so many of the connected elite, is likewise quick to publish unfounded smears and damaging gossip about certain persons, but the media is reluctant to name and shame the real crooks and criminals in our midst, namely those in high places who sanction the exploitation of the most vulnerable, who order the targeting of whistleblowers, who direct the political policing of activists and campaigners, and who sanction the alienation and sacking of outspoken journalists. They have many more paragraphs after that first page, but I would say, and I think Brian will probably want to come in at this point, every word of that could have been spoken about the United Kingdom, actually.
Brian?
Totally agree. Whoever wrote that, I think, deserves a medal because they produced an unbelievably concise description of what's going on in Ireland. And as you say, Alex, we have exactly the same thing going on in UK. I first started to really understand just how bad British courts were when I was first able to go in some of the family courts. And I'll say that when I did go into those family courts, of course, at that time, I was not fully aware that the fact you were just there in front of a judge meant that you were not in front of a court. There was no jury. There was no public present to see justice being done. So we're in a very dangerous position now, be it in Ireland or the UK, because we have single judges. We still don't know how they are appointed. We know they're appointed by the Judicial Appointments Commission, but we don't know who appoints that commission. So these people are appointed, and then they're sitting in a room which they describe as a court. We know by our own constitution that a single room and a single judge is not a court. And then they say that they are now producing law by the decisions in those courts. And of course, we've recently had the head of the law, the gentleman's name's gone out of my head, but he was basically having meetings with very powerful corporations in the City of London, which he was casually saying, well, we're going to develop common law. No. These people are producing effectively a law by statute. This is not common law. And we haven't got proper courts running. That's even aside from the sheer criminality of what's going on in the courts with perjury, false evidence, and it would appear money being creamed off for profit. I better stop on the last bit, which you mentioned yesterday, Mike, and now we're heading into the realms that you don't even appear in those courts. You can apparently just be tried through the Skype system. This is very, very dangerous, particularly when they're building more prison places.
Yeah, I think it was Lord John Thomas you were thinking of there.
Probably was, yes.
Alex?
That was it. I was going to say, Mike, it's Lord Thomas of Cumghiad, the current Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, who said, because he's worried that Scotland's got there first, basically, he said we can tout English common law as a great way to settle business arbitration, a very lucrative thing around the world. And he said in other speeches in Wales that the Singaporeans are beating us to it by selling real English common law. So we better provide a fake with an ermine robe round it because it comes from England and Wales and call it common law. So common law is going to end up the way of the monarchy if we're not careful, being touted for tourists and Asians with money as something really British and spectacular. Who's being tipped hotly to succeed Lord John Thomas of Cumghiad as Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales? None other than Lord Justice Brian Leveson of Common Purpose Inquiry, Leveson Inquiry on the freedom of expression of the press. So I don't like the way that's going at all. Indeed.
Well, look, let's look at what happens when justice breaks down, and Rotherham, of course, is a perfect example of this. So this is Sajid Javid, who has decided to return 7 additional powers to Rotherham Council. These powers are being returned because they were removed following the sex abuse scandal, the child sex abuse scandal in Rotherham. So Sajid Javid has confirmed the return of 7 additional powers to the Metropolitan Borough Council. It's just over 2 years since the government intervention began, and he said he would give the council more control over decisions, including adult social care. This, they say, the government says, is a significant milestone for the council, which regained 12 powers removed last year. The government appointed commissioners will continue to have oversight of all functions returned, while retaining executive decision-making powers on 6 other service areas, including children's services. And Sajid Javid is going to continue to receive quarterly reviews from the commissioners. Now, the Communities Secretary, that's Javid, has also confirmed that Mary Ney will become the lead commissioner, replacing Sir Derek Myers, who we'll mention in more detail in a second because he's stepping down at the end of the month. Here's what Sajid Javid had to say. The return of additional powers to Rotherham reflects the significant progress made by the Council under the watchful eye of our commissioners. I would like to thank Sir Derek, that's Sir Derek Myers, for his 2 years of impressive leadership. The Council will have control over a further 7 functions, including important services such as adult social care. However, the commissioners, now led by Mary Ney, will remain in place and continue to work with the Council to help restore full democratic powers. Well, for more background on this, go and have a look at the Rotherham Common Purpose Effect article on the UK Column website. And in this article, we point out that the 159-page J report, which was the independent inquiry into child sexual exploitation in Rotherham between 1997 and 2013, makes, as it says in the article, more than uncomfortable reading. So what the J inquiry said was that their conservative estimate was that there were approximately 1,400 children sexually exploited over the full inquiry period from 1997 to 2013. It said that they were raped by multiple perpetrators, trafficked to other towns and cities in the north of England, abducted, beaten, intimidated. There were examples of children who had been doused in petrol and threatened to be set alight. They were threatened with guns. They were made to witness brutally violent rapes and threatened they would be next if they told anyone. And this was applying to girls as young as 11, being raped by large numbers so they were being gang raped. So this was the type of thing that was going on. Now, of course, this was mainly being perpetrated by Muslim gangs, and we were sort of criticised in the past for not focusing on that. But our point was always that if you focus on who was actually doing it, that's for the law to do, because the police and the courts should be dealing with that problem. But if you don't deal with the fact of what was going on in the background, and particularly the fact or the question of why this was being allowed to go on in the first place, if you don't deal with that problem, then everything else is moot, because people will continue to get away with it. And the question is, how did they get away with it? Who was it that allowed this to happen? And it could only happen because there was a systematic cover-up. And we would argue, of course, that the whole close collaboration thing that's being pushed by Common Purpose, and particularly the breaking down of silos, as we've discussed earlier, is the reason why this was allowed to happen. So instead of having a separation of powers, we have close colleagues looking out for each other. And then when you add into the mix that, of course, friends are being recruited into particular jobs, it becomes even more dangerous. So, as we've said, Rotherham being put in the hands of several commissioners, and powers being returned as the commissioners become happy with changes that are taking place in the city. But the lead commissioner then was Sir Derek Myers. Now, the key point here is that right at the heart of Rotherham Council was Common Purpose, and it's the Common Purpose regime which has allowed this thing to happen. Now, the question then is, Sir Derek Myers, has he got any connection to Common Purpose? Because if he's there to make the changes that are necessary following the events that took place, if he is coming from the same type of mindset, then how do we actually end up with an improvement in the situation? Well, in fact, Derek Myers, in the past, working in London councils, was part of part of a group called the Capital Ambition Future Subgroup for London Councils. And in a meeting that took place on the 12th of January 2007, which was hosted by Derek Myers, he hosted, among others, Common Purpose. And following that meeting in 2008, Common Purpose was given contracts in order to undertake a major piece of research over 18 months to better understand the challenges of the future and what challenges that was likely to bring, and to in fact, provide what they were describing as solutions to that. So this man has a connection with Common Purpose. And if you're just going to simply put somebody in that has that type of support for that type of thinking and that type of way of doing things, Brian, how are you ever going to improve the situation?
Well, the answer is you are not. And you've raised some really critical points there. I would say that Rotherham has simply not changed at all, because they haven't got to grips with how the abuses were allowed to take place. The abuses were allowed to take place because there was a conspiracy between the very organisations who should have been protecting the youngsters. There was a conspiracy between elements of the police, the local authority, the child safeguarding boards, the inevitable charities that say they're there to protect youngsters. The scale of the abuse can only have taken place with collaboration between those people. And then we come into two areas. We can say that the setting up of the so-called child safeguarding boards brings its own problems, because you are bringing together police, local authority, social services and the charities and others to work together. But this instantly means, as you say, there's no separation of the powers. And therefore, if any one of those agencies is at fault, the other agencies are automatically complicit because they're operating as a group. And then you bring on top of that this pernicious organisation, Common Purpose, where it says that it encourages people to operate as a collaborative behind closed doors. It holds its meetings in a quasi-secret way, even if police are present. So we know we've got Common Purpose police meeting with Common Purpose local authority people, meeting with Common Purpose child safeguarding people. This is a very dirty mix, particularly when in the past we've had paedophiles who have been inside the Common Purpose networks, of which the worst was Matthew Byrne, who was not only in Common Purpose in Merseyside, but of course he was on their advisory board recruiting other people to become Common Purpose leaders. So if you had a paedophile working to recruit other Common Purpose leaders, I would guess he was particularly keen on recruiting other paedophiles, but the police never carried out any investigation. And I'll just end by saying that in the last few hours, I've been able to speak to the very brave Metropolitan Policeman John Wedger. I'm very pleased to say I can use his full name now. John Wedger, who blew the whistle on child abuse, trafficking, prostitution and deaths in London, is now back under horrific pressure from the Metropolitan Police, being threatened with disciplinary action, and of course absolutely no help from Amber Rudd or Cressida Dick, albeit that Miss Dick is not yet in post. So when the police come forward and say how these massive abuse rings can operate, because the authorities are turning a blind eye or are involved or are covering up, what happens to the whistleblowers? They are threatened to keep quiet. This is the despicable state of Britain today.
Just to finish this one, then we'll just mention that obviously Mary Nay is going to take over as the lead commissioner from April. We've also got Patricia Bradwell, who's the Children's Social Care Commissioner, and Julia Kenny, CBE, who's another supporting commissioner, and also Stella Manzi. She's going to finish at the end of, I think she's finished now, at the end of February. So perhaps some of our viewers might like to take some of those names and do a bit of research into the backgrounds of the remaining commissioners and see what we can find out about them. Now, Brian, we're almost out of time, so if we just run quickly through this about the BBC.
Well, yes, let's just go through them. If you move on this slide, there's a bit of text comes up as well. I was just fascinated by this story. We've got 70 MPs have suddenly got very upset with the BBC. They say they're showing bias with regard to Brexit, that the BBC is not covering the pro side, the positive side of Brexit. And so they've written a letter saying, well, this is disgraceful. I think something else is going on here, so I've put an additional label there, propaganda, spin and confusion. I think this is part of a second part of the psychological operation against the public. We've got terror and fear, and now what we've got coming in is confusion. But have a look at this response from the big man himself, the head of the BBC, and what is he actually saying at the moment? Tony Hall, while we are always live to our critics and understand that passions are running high on all sides of the debate, it's the job of the BBC to scrutinise and analyse the issues on behalf of the public and, quote, to hold politicians to account across the political spectrum. Well, of course, that is a complete lie, because the BBC has done everything possible to help cover up for politicians. But he goes on, if we come to the next one, that is what the BBC has been doing. It's precisely what the BBC will continue to do. It is precisely because of this that the public trusts the BBC. These people are delusional. I can't put it more strongly than that. And if that's the BBC comment, then in this article it also quotes this gentleman, Julian Knight. He's a Tory MP for where is it? Solihull, thank you. He says, I worked for the BBC for 5 years and firmly believe it's the greatest repository of media talent anywhere in the world. I've said, is Mr. Knight still drugged up on the BBC ego? But what we've got here as well, this is delusional language. Does this man really believe that the BBC is this leading world media organisation? I think he does, which is what makes it so scary. And if we go on, he says, private media is free to adopt whatever attitude and in print to promote whatever politics it pleases, but the BBC is different. It can't afford to be out of touch with Brexit voters, especially the woefully underrepresented million of them in Scotland and with the towns and villages beyond the great cities where the corporation is based. Well, out of touch, the BBC clearly despises Brexit voters. You can see from article after article in the BBC. But we'll just follow Julian through a bit more. Remember, of course, that he's a Tory. This is especially the case when local BBC news websites are putting such pressure on local newspapers, which not only provide a valuable route into journalism for young people, but are much more likely to reflect the character of their community than the nearest outpost of the sprawling BBC. So what is he talking about? He's talking about the BBC undermining good journalism from family companies. There used to be many family-run newspapers, certainly many locally run newspapers. Those have been hoovered up by the giant media corporations. And this man thinks that BBC is now simply pushing them out. But my main point is both from the Director General of the BBC and this Tory MP delusional language about what the status of the BBC is in UK.
Okay, and are we gonna cover the Bertelsmann stuff here? German supranational corporation Bertelsmann speaks on Brexit.
Well, I'll just mention it. I'm not sure how much more we want to do on the time. We're coming up to 50 minutes, but this was sent through. Thank you to Merit for sending us through this morning. So Bertelsmann, this vast and exceptionally dangerous German conglomerate, has been busy analysing Brexit. And it came up with three basic warnings here. It says in the best case scenario, Britain and the EU countries find a joint solution that minimises losses. And it says that could be an arrangement similar to Norway. The second scenario is a settlement along the lines of the Swiss model. And I think if I remember correctly, the Swiss model of trade with the EU is enabled by 120 separate rules. And then they say the disaster scenario is the Europeans prove unwilling to compromise and there's no chance of a free trade agreement. And I did smile when I saw that Bertelsmann had to say that however German automobile manufacturers with production plants in Britain face higher costs. And here we see the sheer arrogance of the EU and indeed Bertelsmann, because of course those German car manufacturers have been cruising off benefits in UK, having got into our car industry and then wiped it out from the inside. They're simply taking profit out of UK and sending it back to Berlin, effectively.
Alex, that looks like an interesting document you've got there.
This is a book, one of several, which Pierre Hillard has written just on Bertelsmann. He's writing here about La Fondation Bertelsmann, which is the Bertelsmann Stiftung, the Bertelsmann Foundation, which was received its seed capital from the same philanthropist type as started the media organization itself. And the title of this one is La Fondation Bertelsmann et la Gouvernance Mondiale, the Bertelsmann Foundation and world government. And the illustration he's been given on his book cover here is Germany radiating thoughts all over the world. And the back cover blurb says that when one thinks of a think tank, one naturally thinks of the United States, but actually the Germans have lots of Stiftungen, foundations too, and Bertelsmann mediates between the EU and US whenever there are tensions and pushes EU interests, or rather pushes US interests in the EU through the base of Germany. So alongside the media outlets, you have the foundation or Stiftung of Bertelsmann, and as we've mentioned before, they envisage, and have done for 13 years now, that the military, that is the US-German military complex, as it were, will use civil instruments to achieve its goals through the media.
Yes. Brian, any closing thoughts?
Well, I think my greatest thought, Mike, is that it is obvious that democracy is being absolutely demolished in this country. We've got a massive attack, which is led by the British government itself. It's destroying everything. We're seeing manufacturing, what's left of that, decimated. We see the military decimated. We've got education being ripped apart to the extent that our best teachers are leaving. We know the NHS is being ripped apart, is virtually privatized. None of this is happening by accident. This is collaborative action from within the British government. We are being attacked by Westminster, and we've only got to think of Tory MPs who talked about the need for a period of creative destruction to realise that we are being faced with an immensely dangerous political agenda. And this is the bit that we have to work to wake people up to. We are seeing the country falling apart, not by accident, not by the incompetence of the public and people working. We are seeing it being destroyed by a program of destruction, which is being fomented within central government and particularly within the Cabinet Office. And this is what we have to bring out into the open. Big society is a dictatorship. Communitarianism is pretty close to the politics that's being brought into power. But of course, we've also got common purpose burying its political agenda everywhere. And we now know that we've got very dangerous applied behavioural psychology, such as NLP, being used directly on our policemen and women, and indeed on people within the armed forces and the MPs themselves. So this is subversion. It's certainly treason, and we've got to really start bringing this to the surface if we're going to do something about it.
Well, of course, and of course, when we've been discussing common purpose this afternoon, it's been with the capital C and the capital P, the organisation. But what you've described is the common purpose with a small c and a small p that they all talk about in their speeches, and we see this language everywhere. Well, look, we're absolutely over time and out of time, so we've got to leave it there. Thank you both for joining me today. We'll be back at our normal time, 1 o'clock tomorrow. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you then. Bye-bye.